Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Bill Yarbrough. I am the chairman of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio, and thanks for joining us here on Ohio Liberty Live. We are the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio, part of the National Republican Liberty Caucus, and the longest running organization in the Republican Liberty Movement. We are an all-volunteer, all-membership-driven organization. We hope you'll check us out at rlcoh.org, and we hope you'll join us this coming Wednesday night at 7:30, where Ohio Liberty Live will be hosting Congressman Jim Renacci, gubernatorial candidate for the Republican nomination. So we hope you'll join us this coming Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. for another edition of Ohio Liberty Live. Pleased to be with you this morning talking about Ohio issues 1 and 2. Both of them have been very interesting, to say the least, with regards to a lot of the advertising with issue 2, a lot of the misinformation that's been out there. And our organization, the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio, looks at all legislation, including those before the voters on the November 7th ballot, and we seek to provide information to voters, especially Republican voters, regarding these issues. Joining me this morning to talk a little bit about that and what it is the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio does in that regard is our Legislative Affairs Chairman. His name is Mr. Mike Newbern. And Mike, thanks for joining this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today, Bill.
Yeah, great. Your committee does incredible work. And before we jump right to issues 1 and 2, which is what folks chimed in for this morning, would like for you to talk a little bit about your committee, the Legislative Affairs Committee of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio, and what it is that you do.
So the Legislative Affairs Committee takes the legislation and we look at it and we determine whether or not it's going to have any sort of significant impact on liberty in Ohio. As you know, things like renaming a highway, a special license plate, designation of a certain day, things like that, really don't do much to impact liberty negatively or positively. So we can't consider, and we just don't have the bandwidth to actually vote on every single piece of legislation that comes out. So the first step we do is we identify pieces of legislation that do impact, and then we look at the impact they have. Do they impact liberty negatively or positively? Do they advance liberty or do they regress liberty? And then we look at the specific area of government interaction with Ohioans and how it does that. So is it something that grows the size of government? Is it something that impacts a budget? Or is it something that just encroaches on individual liberties and puts more government in our lives? So we take all that information and then we use that to aggregate position on each bill, and then we take the legislators' votes and whether or not they introduce the legislation, and then we score them accordingly. So if a legislator introduces a piece of legislation that we take a yes position on, then of course they're rewarded with a certain number of points in the sponsorship index. And if they introduce a piece of legislation that we take a no position on, then they're rewarded with no points in that same aspect. And votes go the same way. So if they vote with us, they're rewarded positively. If they vote against us, they're rewarded negatively. And then we just, every couple of weeks, once a month, we issue an update to that. So it usually lags behind on legislation by about 2 weeks. So you'll see legislation that was introduced about 2 weeks prior being scored in the index. And so it's actually fleshing out pretty well, and it works out for us pretty well. We've been able to, with this concept, we've been able to positively influence legislators, and our goal is to take a more proactive role in legislation. And so now we actually have legislators reaching out to us, showing us legislation before they introduce it, and get our feedback to try to understand how we would rate it and why we would rate it positively or negatively, and what they can do to change it to be more aligned with the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio's goals of advancing liberty.
Outstanding, Mike. And while you were talking, I was just directing folks to rlcoh.org. And when you go there, you can click on the Liberty Index link, If you click just on the Liberty Index link, there's a short video tutorial. So all the stuff that Mike just told you, a little bit about how it is that we score the legislation and weight specific pieces of legislation on Liberty, you can see that on that brief video. And then when you actually go to the Ohio Legislator Index, you can actually click on individual legislators in the ranking and see what bills there are that we scored, as well as those that are perhaps pending a vote, and they may make it to the floor, and we actually look at their sponsorship as well. So, Mike, thanks so much for walking us through that. I really appreciate it because your committee does incredible work, and if anybody's interested in joining that committee, become a member of the RLCOH. You can do so at rlcoh.org and send us a note. Let us know this is something you have an interest in. I know, Mike, your committee, as well as our candidates committee, our PR committee, they're always looking for talented folks in the Liberty movement to help us out. So thank you for that, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's you don't necessarily have to be someone that you consider yourself to be talented within the Liberty movement to be able to, you're not going to be in the public eye and all that kind of stuff. We really want our positions to reflect the Liberty movement's voice. So we're able to do that more if we have a more diverse range of people on our board.
Yep.
So we're always interested in bringing on more folks onto the Legislative Affairs Committee so that we can make sure that we're hitting all points with respect to the diverse opinions.
Fantastic. So hopefully, as a result of today's broadcast, we get some folks expressing interest. But let's jump right to issues 1 and 2. And our board grappled with these quite a bit. There's a lot of information, misinformation on issue 2, not so much on issue 1. So we had to dig into both a lot, but for different reasons. Mike, let me just start right out of the gate with these issues. That would you agree with me? And we haven't floated this before today's broadcast, so you may not agree with me. But that issues 1 and 2 both have they come from an honest attempt to help people. They both have honest intention. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, and I even think that folks like Senator Feinstein and those folks introduced these knee-jerk gun restrictions after tragic events like we had last week. I think their intentions are all good. I think they're misguided, but their intentions are definitely good. So yeah, I agree with that here. Is that the case? I believe the intentions are good, but I do believe that the pathway is not the best pathway to go.
Gotcha. Well, let's start with issue 1. That's the one where I don't think there's been as much information out there, and so we actually had to do some digging, and with your assistance, the board came to a unanimous decision on issue 1. Issue 1 is referred to as Marsy's Law, and it is a national movement that started in California with great intentions. It actually started as a result of a victim not knowing that the person who had victimized her was released. There was no notification, and she was obviously traumatized. I believe it was a sexual assault, a violent sexual assault, if I recall correctly. And as a result of that, she had to see her perpetrator, the person who had changed her life forever, in the supermarket or something of that nature. And so I think there was an honest attempt to ensure that victims have some rights with regards to knowing what's happening with those folks who victimize them. And so Marsy's Law has been marching across the country. Ohio is kind of the next in line. Mike, tell us a little bit about what your thoughts on this, because if I recall correctly, Ohio has Section 10.2 in the Constitution that already deals with victims' rights. So, what was your thought process looking at Marsy's Law?
Well, the first thing that we wanted to identify is several of us on the board are either connected to someone who's been a victim of some sort of assault, sexual or physical in nature, or have been victims ourselves. And so, we definitely want to make sure that the victim's rights are protected and that the victim is, we do everything we can within the scope of, judicial, proper judicial process to protect those victims in the future. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to look at current legislation. We want to look at current law to see what current law did to provide victims that protection. And we really had a hard time finding gaps in that. There are a lot of points where we don't want judges to have leeway in certain things, but there are a lot of times where we find that judges need to have leeway in certain things, and there are There are great drug programs all across the country that judges act as interdictionaries into those programs and help get people off of drugs and reduce rates of recurrence, of relapse, recidivism within respect going back to prison. And it's because we move away from the 3 strikes you're out rule and mandatory sentencing rules, and sometimes those don't apply. And so we felt like there was enough leeway in the way the current legislation was set up to allow judges to be able to step in and protect the victims and not encroach on the rights that the accused. It's important to understand that a lot of times at these processes, and particularly with issue 1, it addressed some of the things at the accused level. So someone who hasn't been found guilty of a crime yet. And we felt like that was sufficient. So if it's sufficient, then why do we need to have more legislation? That's the first question we ask. If it's already sufficient, then why codify it? And sometimes, honestly, the Ohio Constitution goes through a refresh period. And it went through a refresh period in 2015, shortly after the 2014 election. And when I ran for a state house down in District 17 in Southwest Columbus, my opponent, who initially won, served on that board. And he did because he had a great historical knowledge of the Ohio Constitution. And so they basically just helped reorganize some things, clarify some things, didn't change the intent of the Constitution, but just gave it a refresh. And so sometimes that is necessary to have an amendment that puts things together and make it easier to follow and specifically codifies the intent of the legislature instead of having to go to case law or having to go to notes, assembly notes, meeting notes, and all things are scattered all over the place. Once again, that wasn't the case here. We didn't feel like there was a disjunct of information all over the place that required some sort of collection of information in one central location, i.e. the Constitution. So we felt like there wasn't really a need to change things. And then if there's not a need to change things, then why are we changing it? And if there's not a need to change things, but it doesn't hurt to change it, then why not change it? Right. The issue with changing the Constitution is that it's a long and arduous process that takes a great amount of effort. And so if it's not already broken and we change it and break it in the process of changing it, which we've done before several times, then fixing it back is very problematic and very painful and impacts a bunch of people negatively all along the way. So even without looking at the full details of issue 1, we were very skeptical about the need to pass issue 1.
I think it's a great synopsis, Mike, and for those folks looking here on screen, and if you're not familiar with Ballotpedia, at ballotpedia.org, I think they've got one of the best synopsis that's very, very nonpartisan and is very objective, looking at a definition of what issue 1 does. It actually has a screenshot of the current law in the Constitution and what would be stricken and what it would be replaced with. Mike, the thing that struck me about issue 1 and some of the advertising that I've seen, the minimal advertising that there is, speaks to the fact that, there are victims who still today are not getting the information that they need with regards to their accusers being released or that being a parole hearing or something of that nature. And I think what's important for everybody to recognize, just as you said so brilliantly, is that there already is that mechanism in place. And if there are local courts, local prosecutors who are not doing their job, as is already required by the Ohio Constitution, to inform victims, then that is something that needs to be remedied through legislation that is already permitted by the constitutional amendment. There's nothing that's going to change with Marcy's law that is going to put any teeth into any local prosecutor or court that's not already doing their job, that's already required by the Constitution. So if you hear that, hey, we need Marcy's law because there are victims that are not being informed, that their accusers are being released, or what have you, that's not going to change as a result of Marcy's law. However, looking at some of the information on ballotpedia.org, there are some local public defenders and folks, former legislators that are coming out against Marcy's law, because what it does do, as you said already, Mike, is that it puts into the Constitution new language that would be very, very hard to change if there's nothing broken today. And one piece that is drawing some criticism and could be problematic is it explicitly says that victims are to have no fewer rights than the accused. Well, we've got the Fourth and Fifth Amendment to the federal Constitution. We've got protections in the Ohio Constitution, and you can't just throw language like that willy-nilly. When you say that victims have the same right as the accused, what exactly does that mean? And that it could be interpreted to put this incredible bottleneck into the courts with regards to victims being able to take untold amounts of time and energy that would cost incredible taxpayer dollars and would delay justice for those folks who really do need it and those victims who really are waiting for it. So very concerned about that. Nothing's broken. Let's not fix it. So no on issue 1. Is that a pretty good synopsis?
That's a pretty good synopsis. There are a couple things I'd like to add as well.
Sure.
Issue one talks about a right to a speedy resolution for the victim. And we're concerned that means that it would be interpreted as a right to a speedy trial for the accused, or a right to a speedy trial at the victim's request,
right?
Despite the accused despite the accused's need to slow things down. Our judicial system is based on the idea of innocent until proven guilty. And so our concern is that the accused may find themselves in a situation where they're having to respond to things really quickly and having to rush things through, and they're not able to provide adequate defense for themselves because Marcy's Law empowers the victim to demand a speedy resolution. So that's a concern for us. Another concern for us, and a huge concern for us, is the board or the Legislative Affairs Committee. On the judicial side, is that the victim really can opt out of discovery. So if you are if you're the accused and the victim is saying that you committed this horrible offense, and then you start asking for proof, for evidence, for factual-based evidence, the victim can say, I don't want to provide that for whatever reason. Now, there are a lot of times where it is traumatic in nature for victims to be able to revisit that that horrific event or that attack, and have to produce that evidence. But in order to bring those kinds of things to justice, we have to find evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused is guilty of the crime. And sometimes that requires cooperating with discovery. Actually, every time it requires cooperating with discovery. And my concern is that this particular amendment would allow victims to opt out of discovery. And then it would really just be a he said, she said, or a she said, he said, however, the relationship is, to just go to court and it just be, two people pointing fingers at each other. That's not how our judicial system operates.
Very good. Well, thank you for walking everybody through that, because there hasn't been a lot of information about issue 1, and hopefully everybody found that of interest. Let's shift gears, Mike, and let's talk about issue 2, because this has got the exact opposite problem. There's a lot of information out there. Many would say misinformation regarding this. So for those just now becoming familiar with it, this is not a constitutional amendment, but rather a legislative effort, or a law effort that would put on the books a requirement that Ohio agencies that purchase drugs and negotiate prices with the drug company pay no more than what the Veterans Administration pays for the same drugs. And at face value, I got to tell you, Mike, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. I was probably one of the most vocal people on the board right now that even though Matt Borges and Bernie Sanders were for this, that we not take a knee-jerk approach to this. That, actually from a libertarian perspective, it sounded pretty good that you're tying the hands of government and requiring that they pay the lowest available possible price. So at first blush, I looked at this and said, wait a second, guys, let's really dig into this. Let's put aside who's advocating for it right now, and let's look at this piece of legislation that's going to come as a ballot initiative, and maybe it's something that makes sense. Maybe it's something that we should truly look at. And then you add the misinformation with regards to people making this about Weinstein, who is the proponent of it and who has backed it in California where it failed, brought it to Ohio, and his ties and his deep pockets, and making it about a personal attack. And you're like, my goodness gracious, what is the real truth here? So, Mike, walk us through what we uncovered with regards to issue 2.
Well, you're correct. On the surface, issue 2 does sound like it has a positive impact on the Ohio budget. And if we were to consider it in that scope only, then I believe issue 2 would, would fare very well in getting a yes position from the committee. However, we don't operate in a silo, and we try to consider things across, all the different spectra where people can be impacted. And so, while yes, it does on the surface look like it's a positive impact to Ohio budget, there are a whole bunch of things that happen in the background of the Ohio budgetary process that really just kind of mask stuff. So, we can ask ask the drug manufacturers to reduce the price or demand they reduce the price, and if you want to sell it to us, you have to reduce the price of this particular drug. But at the same time, we can turn around and, through some sort of rebate or kickback process, compensate for that reduction in price. So there's the opportunity that there's really no, a net zero impact on the Ohio budget. Now let's imagine the case where there is a positive impact on the Ohio budget. Now, drug companies, for all the evil that is ascribed to them, are companies, and they're in business to earn money for their shareholders. That's what corporations do, and it's in their best interest to get the most they can for the product that they sell. If they are not getting enough money for the product that they sell, then they will quit selling that product. We see this all the time. We see it with, Blockbuster goes out of business as Netflix comes in town, and we're seeing a lot of brick and mortar stores are having a hard time keeping up with, the Amazons and the way that they're pioneering delivery. These businesses can't compete, and so they either shift their business models into things where they can compete, more service-oriented businesses and less product-driven businesses, or they go out of business. And the same thing will happen for drug companies. Drug companies will either scale off the drugs that they aren't earning enough money on, or they will shift that burden to the private sector. So the Ohioan sees the burden decrease at their tax level, and we all know, Bill, that and people listening out there, that legislators never reduce our taxes. So even if we're seeing they talk about reducing the rate of tax increase and sell that to us as a tax decrease, and that's just not the case at all. We all know it's very rare that we see a reduction in our taxes. So if we're saving money on the government side and we're not seeing a reduction in our taxes equivalent to that, but then the drug companies that are privately owned drug companies have to make up the difference in cost somewhere, they're going to shift that burden onto the individual. So the individual Ohio taxpayer sees a net increase instead of a net decrease, because you're just shifting the cost and the government's not giving us the savings back with respect to tax savings. That for us was the deciding factor. That that either you could eliminate certain drugs from the marketplace because the government's no longer going to pay the going rate for them, the Ohio marketplace, and you would shift the burden of cost of those drugs onto the individuals that would have to go out and buy them on some sort of private insurance. And so that's why we were a resounding no.
Very good. I think, that explanation makes a lot of sense to me. And, I was still on the fence even after hearing that explanation, Mike, and all the work that you and your committee did to kind of help uncover all that. I was still on the fence because I'm like, all right, so it's a wash. We save a little bit here, we spend a little bit more there. It's a wash. Why not give it a try? It was tried elsewhere, and it failed by ballot initiative. Why not be at the forefront and give it a whirl? And what was the deciding factor for me personally, and you're right, for the committee, for the board as a whole, I think you explained it perfectly. For me, in kind of my head, because I'm a little warped, Mike, I need a little something else. And I think for me, what it was that the Veterans Administration negotiates their prices with these drug companies in secret. This is not a known issue. So if we put into Ohio law the fact that Ohio entities that purchase drugs have to use the VA negotiated price, and the VA is not obligated, and as a matter of fact, they purposefully keep that information secret, what happens? So it's a litigious nightmare. So for a potential wash and maybe a negligible benefit to the Ohio taxpayer, what we are getting is years after years after years of litigation with regards to Ohio fighting the feds to disclose something that they're not legally obligated to disclose. It's an absolute mess. So I, for one, and I don't know about you, Mike, and your committee, but I, for one, would like to revisit this type of issue, this kind of approach, tying the hands of the state government and requiring that they pay at some lower discounted rate. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, but I think issue 2 is a wrong-headed way to approach that very thing. What do you think?
Yeah, that's correct. And, so aside from the secrecy of the VA negotiating drug prices, the Veterans Administration services veterans. And I'm a veteran myself. We have different needs than the general population. So the Veterans Administration is going to negotiate certain drug prices based on the needs of its customers. The needs of Ohioans more represent the general population. And so our needs are different. So let's say, for example, that the VA comes back and says, we don't necessarily need this, this drug as much as you're selling it for, and so we're going to, negotiate a lower price with you in this drug. And the state of Ohio comes back and says, well, we actually need this drug a whole bunch, and we need you to be able to produce it in a rapid manner. We need it, we need you to be able to sell it to us very quickly. Those things require extra cost. So our hands are bound to negotiate a higher price for drugs that Ohio would purchase that we have a higher need for than the Veterans Administration does. So it limits our ability to go to the marketplace with higher bargaining power. Right?
Right. Makes
these things are all really important, and I think the difference that we're seeing I kind of want to tie the two together here before the end of our conversation. I think the difference that you're seeing in the press that issue 1 and issue 2 are getting is really based on money, and it's a very unfortunate thing because issue 1 has a significant more impact to the individual on the very personal level. And issue 2 has impact to the individual on the financial level. But when you start to put corporations into the game and you get special interest groups that go out and hire lobbyists and funnel money in secret to certain places to pay for campaigns, then you really start to muddy the waters. So I think that issue 2 gets a lot of attention because it's tied to money, directly to money. Issue 1 isn't getting a lot of attention because it's not tied directly to money. Right. And unfortunately, my concern, Bill, is that issue 1 is going to is basically just going to pass with flying colors because it's being sold to us as a way to protect victims, and we all want to protect victims. There's no question, no doubt about that. We all definitely want to protect victims. But it's flawed. And as we discussed today, it's definitely flawed. Issue 2 is going to get a lot more scrutiny because it's in our faces, because we're seeing it in our advertisements on TV, we're seeing it on the radio, we're seeing it in our social media feeds. People are talking about it because it has to do with money. And my concern here is that we're going to pass over 1, and it's going to get a vote almost down party lines, kind of like what party line voting does for us at the local level and at the state level. Issue 1 is going to get the same kind of treatment. It protects the victims, so we should definitely pass it because it's for the victims. Well, it's flawed. Issue 2, we're going to really study issue 2. And I'm going to educate myself with issue 2 because that's tax money.
Right.
Well, we should give them both the same kind of attention, right? So hopefully today's conversation will spark that attention in folks.
I hope so as well. Mike, I want to say thank you so very much for joining this morning. You do much more research than the layperson and even myself, on the board of the RLCOH, and we couldn't do what we do without you. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's made a big difference, and hopefully we've educated some folks along the way. So thanks again for joining us, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. And go Bucks.
Go Bucks. All right. So that about wraps it up. Again, hopefully you will join us also this coming Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. where Ohio Liberty Live will host Congressman Jim Renacci, gubernatorial candidate for the Republican nomination early next year. I think that we'll have some really good conversation to have there. We extended an invitation to all the gubernatorial candidates for the Republican nomination, and Congressman Renacci is the only one to respond affirmatively thus far. Make of that as you will. Also, if you like what you've heard, you believe we're performing a valuable service, please consider becoming a member of the RLCOH, the Republican Liberty Caucus of Ohio, at rlcoh.org. Everything we do here is volunteer-based. We're completely membership fee-driven, and everything that we're doing to keep the lights on our webpage, etc., is all paid for by membership dues of $45 a year, and you have an opportunity to play a part on some of our statewide committees or build out our local affiliates as well. We have 2 local county affiliates of the RLCOH doing at a city, township, and county level what we are doing here at the state level, and working with one another to change the force of liberty in Ohio. So thank you again so much for joining us this morning. Have a great day. Have a great day of college football. Go Bucks. And hopefully we'll see you Wednesday night, 7:30 with Congressman Jim Renacci. Have a great day, everybody.